Hello, everybody. It is December the 26th, 2024, as the year begins to wind down. We've been doing some reviews, and who better to bring in to review 2024 in terms of the Middle East than my old friend, classmate, someone I've known for many years, Soli Ozel, is based in Istanbul, although he's spending this year in Vienna. He's talking to us from Istanbul. And it always seems to be a momentous year in the Middle East, but 2024 particularly momentous. The headlines today, ongoing conflict in Gaza, 5 journalists are killed in an Israeli strike, 3 babies are dying from cold. Amnesty International claims that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. I know that Soli, you want to begin in Gaza, maybe not so much in a humanitarian sense, but in a geopolitical sense, because when, and I'm putting words into your mouth, correct me please if I'm wrong.
No, you're not yet anyway.
You see, perhaps if we're to unravel the complexity of the Middle East 2024, we need to begin in Gaza. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think we ought to begin back in 2003, the invasion of Iraq, if not the attack on the Twin Towers. Because I think when Yahya Sinwar, the late leader of Hamas in Gaza, basically gave the green light for this incredible operation to attack Israel.
And this was last year, of course.
This is in October of 2023. He probably expected to have results that were different than what we've seen so far. And one of those things, I think he miscalculated on whether or not Iran and Hezbollah would come to its aid, to Hamas's aid in full force. That didn't happen. And he probably expected the Palestinian uprisings in all of the Mandate Palestine. That means including Israel proper, where 21% of the population are Palestinians. That didn't happen either. And he certainly probably did not anticipate that the Israeli response would be so furious that, as your clip suggests, Israel is being accused of committing genocide. Mind-boggling numbers of people. Many of those are women and children have been.
Yeah, what is it up to about? And these numbers are, there's something chillingly meaningless. 45,000 dead Palestinians.
Exactly. And that may actually, once the dust settles, that may turn out to be more conservative than the actual numbers. And then. Probably what he must not have thought of at all was that what he instigated, once the Israelis took control of the situation, led to the destruction of the so-called axis of resistance that the Iranians have created. Now, why do I say I take it back at least to 2003? The Iraq War, which was an ill-conceived adventure, which actually blew in the face of the United States. It proved to be unsuccessful. And I guess that at least some people who were who were present in the making of that war and prepared the logic of that war, thought that after Iraq, it would be the turn of the regime in Iran. Remember, somebody at some point who was serving in Iraq said, all men can go to Baghdad, real men go to Tehran.
Yeah, and this was the sort of the domino theory of the neocons of Wolfowitz and
it wasn't just domino theory. They thought they could control Iraq and then it would make Iran more vulnerable. What they did not obviously prepare for was that once they destroyed Saddam's regime and could not actually create order or install their people, those people who got elected in Iraq happened to be people who spent many years in exile in Tehran and were probably very close ideologically and politically to the Iranians. And given the fact that Iraq was the only country in the Gulf that could actually counterbalance Iran's power, Then you offer Iraq on a silver plate to Iran, and suddenly Iran has contiguity of territory to go from Tehran to Beirut. And of course, in Beirut, its investment in Hezbollah since 1982, its investment in Syria, which actually created the corridor so that Hezbollah could be supplied and all that, made Iran the most important, the most powerful country in the region, and it turned it into a Eastern Mediterranean power, and brought it to the borders of Israel, and it could then use its non-state allies, Hamas and Hezbollah, to put pressure on Israel and actually have its deterrence lines established on Israel's borders rather than near its own borders.
Soli, let me ask you one thing, and I apologize for the naivety of this question. Was this also a Shia arc, an Iranian Shia
arc?
Well,
that is what the Sunni. I mean, given the fact that the Middle Eastern states are predominantly Sunni and Arab, and in Iraq, of course, a mainly Sunni Ba'ath Party led a majority of Shia and the Kurds there. Yes, the fall of Iraq, and the reason why the fall of Iraq was seen as a major catastrophe by many of the Arab countries in the region that had, I mean, I don't want to identify them solely as Sunni powers, but obviously the fear that now a Shia crescent was created and Iran was taking advantage of that and actually becoming a hegemonic power in the region. That was in their calculations, and I think ultimately that the concern that Iran became too powerful led signing of the Abraham Accords, which were by and large a joining of forces between two Gulf states, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, and then Morocco in return for Western Sahara, and Sudan in return for sanctions lifting. But for the important ones were Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. That was a way of protecting themselves against potential Iranian threats. And in the meantime, Saudi Arabia, the big, most important Arab country in the Gulf region anyway, it didn't normalize relations with Israel. It was not a signatory to the Abraham Accords, but it eased its relations with Israel. Remember that Bibi Netanyahu showed up on the soil of Saudi Arabia informally.
Yeah, and Soli, you're Istanbul-based. You know as much about Turkey as anyone. What about the Turkish place in this complex jigsaw?
Well, Turkey was also not terribly happy that Iran got so powerful. But unlike Israel and the Saudis earlier, it did not have any hysterical reaction to Iran, did not try to change its regime, did not really want war, it still doesn't. After all, these are two legatees of empires, the Persian Empire and the Safavid Empire and the Turkish and the Ottoman Empire, and they could always compete and cooperate depending on the circumstances. But Turkey was also not very happy with the growing Iranian influence, and that was part and parcel of its investment in Syria before the civil war in Syria broke. I mean, remember the Turkish then Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and his wife vacationed with Bashar al-Assad and his wife Asma. And of course, things changed after the Arab revolts. Then Turkey also had some hegemonic aspirations. They fell through, but then at the end of the day, now everybody talks about Turkey as the keystone in rebuilding or recreating Syria. But let me finish my first thought, then you can ask your questions. So what I think the Israelis had done, once they have reacted to Hamas and destroyed it by and large militarily and destroyed Gaza and made it uninhabitable, they turned to Hezbollah, and apparently preparations for that were already in place before the October 7 attack. And where we ended up with the flight of Bashar al-Assad is the geopolitical environment conjecture, balance of power that was a result of the American invasion of Iraq has been totally broken and destroyed by the Israelis. And some Israelis are now speaking of a Pax Hebraica, which I think is also a pipe dream. But the post-2003 geopolitical reality in the region, whereby Iran was a predominant power, no longer is there. And that is the geopolitical consequence of everything that had happened in the past 15 months.
So might it be fair to say, Soli, that 2024 is a year in which it may not be hopeful, but slowly but surely the reality of Israel as the major power in the region is being acknowledged, for better or worse, by everybody? And that if there is a peace, it has to come through, well, it's probably not Tel Aviv anymore, it's Jerusalem.
Well, the thing is, there is no question that in terms of military prowess, Israel is number one. But just please, let's be honest with ourselves that without the United States, Israel could not have won in the way that it did. That's number one. Number two, to try, as I said earlier, to try to create a Pax Hebraica, I just read a piece in Haaretz as well, is as illusory as the Iranians thinking they could do that on their own, or the Turks thought at some point that they could do that on their own. And finally, Israel will have to, I mean, look at the reaction of the Saudis when it appeared that the next target was going to be Iran, especially if Iran retaliated to the latest Israeli assault on its defenses. They immediately started to normalize relations with Iran, because nobody except for the Bibi Netanyahu government in Israel wants a war between Israel and Iran, which might also implicate or actually introduce the United States in the war zone. So in that sense, Israel's interests, as it is perceived by some of its security establishment, do not really fall in harmony with the interests of any other country in the region. Therefore, if you want to be hegemonic, you really have to give something as well, to think that you are always right and you can do whatever you want.
Even Saudi, even the Gulf states.
Yeah, the Saudis even, I think, extended some loans to the Iranians to bridge something so that they could pay. Nobody wants a war against Iran in the region. Nobody wants Iran to now go to its nuclear program and then rush to get a nuclear weapon either, because its forward defenses have been demolished by the Israelis. It can no longer.
So let me reverse the question. It's always easy to talk about what people don't want.
Okay.
So what do people in 2024? It's a catastrophe, certainly a humanitarian one, as everybody knows. But it also offers, as you suggested, opportunities. What do people want? I mean, what are people talking about in Saudi, in Baghdad, in Istanbul? What is realistic?
Look, I'll put aside the realistic thing. What people want is actually what most people anywhere around the world want: is normality.
But that goes without saying.
Now, let me finish. The Saudis have their Project 2030. They want to be able to invest all their energy into that, rather than worry or whether or not there will be another war, which might actually harm their interests. Because if you attack Iran, will the Iranians have the wherewithal to attack, I don't know, refineries in Saudi Arabia, send a few missiles if they think they're collaborating and all that? So nobody really wants a war. That's number one. So what if you want me to put it in the affirmative, they want peace and they want to be able to actually work on prosperity. I think the relaxation of tensions is also something that the Iraqi government would want, because I also doubt that they are very happy to be under the thumb of the Iranian regime all the time. You can also see indications of that among some of the Shia parties, most notably, I think, Muqtada Sadr's, but I think the Iraqi prime minister would also like to have a much broader space for action politically and see the relaxation of Iran's grip. So, and of course, in Syria, you need reconstruction. The refugees want to go back home. The Turks, the Lebanese, and the Jordanians would want nothing more than being able to send the refugees back to Syria. And then in Istanbul as well, yes, the reconstruction, I mean, in Ankara, the reconstruction of Syria, which means, of course, big money for Turkish contracting firms, the return of most of the refugees. I don't think all of the refugees can actually return. The creation of a more peaceful environment so that there can be business in the region. And finally, the eradication of terroristic threats from the extension of the PKK in Syria, the PYD-YPG, which is being supported by the United States, and it's been a bone of contention between the two NATO allies, US and Turkey, to see the end of this and not feel threatened by a possible Kurdish regional administrative or entity which might have some autonomy.
I want to get to the Kurds and Turkey later. But let's talk specifically about 2024. You and I, you've been following the region for many years. You and I sat in a class back in the 80s on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there was violence then, there was Hezbollah, there was the Shias and all the rest of it. How long-term is what happened in 2024? I mean, everyone writes about Hezbollah being weakened, but they're not destroyed. I assume that they still have a fundamental support in Lebanon. And even Hamas itself, what changed in 2024 on the ground? Could 2025 just be a year where these groups, some call them terrorists, others call them freedom fighters, simply rebuild, or has something profoundly changed?
Yeah, that cannot be easy, Andrew. I mean, first of all, we don't know exactly until the dust settles and the Gazans can start having food and medicine, which the Israelis in most cases are blocking, and then some degree of normality, at least an absence of bombardments all the time, comes to their lives, we're going to find out much more clearly what they really think of what the Hamas did on the 7th of October, given the immense, incredible humanitarian and otherwise price that the Gazans were forced to pay for a political gambit that ultimately I don't think worked. The same thing goes for Hezbollah. Yes, I mean, Hezbollah obviously has, or at least we think that it has the support of a majority of the Shia, for which it has been not just the provider of security, not only it didn't just have arms, it also provided social services. It was basically a sub-state actor working for its community and actually providing a lot of things to that community. What is that community feeling today, now that there are no villages to return to for many of them? The Israelis made a quarter of Lebanon's population refugees. Most of those people are Shia as well. There too, and also I think politically Hezbollah is weakened. The question is, if there is no reconstruction, if there is no move forward for normalization of life in either Gaza or Hezbollah or in Lebanon, and definitely in the West Bank as well, where the Israelis keep on annexing territory and trying to push the villagers out of their villages, and where is this? Unless there is such a progress, and unless there's money that richer countries are interested in investing so that you can actually get things going, then yes, you're right. It can be vigilante justice. It may be total anarchy. It would be Mad Max Redux, if you will.
Yeah, and I like the way, I mean, this is, I don't know about liking, but I think this Mad Max imagery is relevant, this dystopian, apocalyptic world. Is this what Netanyahu wants, to essentially turn southern Lebanon and maybe parts of Syria and obviously Gaza into something out of American science fiction of just this destroyed world, a kind of a return to complete anarchy, to
It, it, it,
pre-capitalism.
it, it appears that he would not be awfully sorry seeing it that way. But I would argue that if we're going to think in the long run, Israel should have an interest in having more stable countries in its neighborhood. But I really doubt that this is what Bibi Netanyahu either aspires to or actually wants.
And then what about, let's Soli, talk about Syria. I don't know whether you were taken by surprise with what happened, but make sense of the collapse of the Assad regime. And also, it strikes me again that there was something particularly evil about this second Assad, or the son of Assad regime in Syria. I mean, obviously Saddam Hussein was no Father Christmas, and there have been many bad regimes in especially in the Arab world. But was there something uniquely evil about this Assad regime, that he basically turned what they controlled into Syria into a narco state? In terms of evil, it seems as if Assad achieved a special kind of, I don't know whether he achieved it or descended into it. Make sense of Assad for us.
I mean, first, the one thing I can say about Assad is he's proven to be a big coward. I mean, he fled the country without even telling his closest associates, most notably Butayna Shaban, whom he inherited from his father. He didn't even tell his brother that he was leaving. That's really disgraceful. But I suppose you should expect that from him. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether one should even try to compare who was more brutal, Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad. I don't think there's a point in there. In doing that, what we should look forward to is what's going to happen in Syria today. And my fear is that unless the monopoly of means of violence is finally obtained clearly by the central government, which is now being headed by the formerly terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its bounty, $10 million bounty prize-given leader Ahmed al-Shara, Mr. Golani or Jolani, unless that monopolization of means of violence is achieved, there we will see a lot more skirmishes in Syria, because some armed groups did not accept to join the Syrian military, and the fact that others did join the Syrian military still does not mean that they will not actually pursue within the military structure their own interests. So it is good that the international community supports the new trajectory on which Syria is today. But unless the money comes in, unless help comes in, unless guidance comes in, and unless violence can be contained, if not stopped, it will be a long road. I mean, remember that we're talking about close to $500 billion that are needed apparently to start reconstructing Syria. Many people will not be able to go back to their homes because those homes no longer exist. There are plenty of things, and you've already begun to see that Bashar loyalists are fighting the new government. I'm sure the Iranians will have some tricks, some cards up their sleeve as well. And there are other groups. The Kurds have not yet dropped their weapons, and they are currently fighting against the Turkish affiliated, the so-called Syrian National Army in Manbij. So it's not all is calm yet, and the creation of authority is of paramount importance. And what other countries are going to do about it is my big question. And I'm wondering if the Saudis, who have practically abandoned the Levant, they're not underwriting the Lebanese military any longer and all that, will they, after what had happened, be interested in helping materially, financially, the reconstruction of those two countries? That, for me, is the big question.
You talk about Bashar loyalists. I've always understood the two Assad regimes as being Alawite regimes, which is a sort of a branch of Shia Islam, and the new regime is a Sunni one. Lots of talk about how it's connected with the old Al Qaeda. Is this just like in Iraq, a shift in power from the reverse of Iraq in many ways, a shift in power from Alawite Shia power to Sunni power in Syria?
I am utterly disturbed by this facile way of putting it that I see prevalent in the West, particularly in the discourse of.
Well, thank you for correcting me, Soli. Explain
why.
It's facile.
But the thing is, I mean, there were enough Sunnis supporting the Assad regime because they did not want jihadists to come to power. I mean, Bashar's father's great accomplishment was that he, after a first period in power, yes, security-wise, he relied mostly on his own community, the Alawites of Syria, but he also tried to broaden the base of the Ba'athi regime and include it didn't just include the Christians, but also Sunni business people. Remember that in 1982, when Assad the father massacred the rebels in the city of Hama, we still don't know how many people died. It's estimated between 15 to 30,000 people. The Sunni elites, business elites in Damascus basically whistled. And so, I mean, if you choose to read what is happening solely on sectarian terms, then it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. And quite frankly, I never met a moderate jihadi. Once you are a jihadi, you are a jihadi. And so I like the talk of Ashara that they will respect the plurality of Syrian population. And I think this is the kind of thing that to the extent that it exists, the international community should actually be pursuing and pushing on the new regime.
I want to talk about the Americans, of course, but what about the Syrian fiasco, as one writer put it, seen from Moscow? Assad, you note, Bashar is a utter coward. He ran away from Syria, didn't even tell his brother. He went with his wife. Apparently his wife might even want to separate from him.
They denied that. Yeah, that apparently.
They denied it, but for what? I mean, clearly they're not perhaps the most happily married couple. How catastrophic was 2024 for Russia in the region? I mean, what does Putin want? I mean, is he only thinking of this purely in terms of Ukraine?
So it looks. First of all, my understanding is that everybody, the Iranians, the Russians, everybody was sick and tired of Bashar, who just did not make any concessions whatsoever. I mean, this man was invited and joined the Arab League. In return, the Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, wanted him to stop the production and sale of Coptagon, which is an addictive synthetic drug. And he didn't do it. This was one of its cash makers, if you will. And so the Russians couldn't or didn't want to help him. But I think the Russians are going to stay in their bases, the naval base in Tartus and the air base in Hmeimim. But it will, if you, as we say in Turkish, it will dent their charisma, because they could, I mean, in 2015, they were the ones who saved the Bashar Assad regime. And this time around, they just couldn't do it, or they didn't do it. So are they as reliable as they always claim to be is going to be a big question. And whether or not this also suggests that the Russian power is limited, that also does not bode well for the image of Moscow or Vladimir Putin.
And then what about the view from Tehran? There's a headline this morning: Iran takes first steps towards easing its social media bans. It's going to allow WhatsApp and Google Play. Maybe it will have a more liberal policy than the US, which is in the business of banning TikTok. Has anything changed domestically in Iran in 2024? And again, excuse the facile assumption that Iran, there's always a tension between conservatives and, if not liberals, certainly reformers. Is that fair? And has anything changed in 2024? Has the fall of, let me just finish the question. Has the relative failure of certainly Hezbollah and obviously Hamas and Syria, has that changed the balance of power politically in Iran?
I think a lot has changed in Iran. First of all, let's recall that the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, who was as hardline as you can actually get, who was supported by the religious leader Ali Khamenei, died in a plane crash. There are still doubts as to whether or not it was a crash or suicide. I don't know. Okay, and then what happened? The current president, Mr. Peshkinyan, who was far more liberal than any of the other contenders, was allowed to run in the contest because I think Ali Khamenei understood that the regime had a deepening legitimacy problem, and they had to give some breathing space to their population, which has been protesting, tortured, murdered because, you know, of hijab and stuff. And you can see today as well that on the one hand, women are not wearing the hijab. On the other, the hardliners in the Iranian Majlis are trying to pass a law which would make it a criminal offense and punishable by death if you're not wearing the proper attire as a woman. So those tensions in Iranian society are real, and therefore the political struggle between the more liberal or liberally oriented regime principles and the more hardline oriented regime principles is actually real, and it is acting up. And Ali Khamenei is 85 years old. Presumably he has cancer. How long is he going to live? And there are plenty of important decisions that the Iranians will have to make. The hardliners want to build a nuclear weapon. They also don't want any reconciliation with the United States, whereas the current president wants Iran to normalize and to establish normal relations with the rest of the world, and most notably with the West. So that power struggle, I think is, and the result of that power struggle is going to be a very important thing for us to be able to see what might happen even beyond 2025.
And what about the resistance to the? Sorry, go on.
That also is a function of what President Trump is going to decide to do with Iran.
All right, and I'm going to come to Trump in a second.
Maximum pressure, or maybe try to find an accommodation. I mean, why did Elon Musk speak with the permanent representative of Iran at the UN right after the elections? I don't know, in the United States, that is. So there are lots of unknowns, and you know, one of the big characteristics of Donald Trump is to leave everyone guessing. So we'll see after the 20th of January what he will choose to do.
Yeah, and I want to come to Trump in a second there. Of course, Rumsfeld used to talk about the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. Just before we leave Iran, what about resistance to the regime? Lots of stories, maybe they're slightly propagandistic in the West, about the unpopularity of the regime, the anger of young people. That may be true across the Middle East, perhaps also in Turkey as well. But is it possible that 2025 might be a year where real cracks appear in the Iranian regime, or is that just wishful thinking in the West?
No, I do think that there are cracks in the regime. Otherwise, the current president would not have been elected. And the current president has made his position very clear that he wants nothing more than reconciliation and normalizing relations with the West, and most notably the United States. And his hardline opponents do not. So that is a very, and of course it's all being played out over the bodies or the clothing of women. And this will go on. This will go on. And this regime, the hardliners particularly of this regime, which have made their population subject to electricity cuts in a country that actually produces gas and oil and sells it to the rest of the world so that we can have electricity, is a scandal. And by the way, when you see the Bashar al-Assad regime collapse, don't you think that the Iranian population will ask, why on earth did you invest billions of dollars in such a corrupt regime when we needed all that money to be invested domestically? So on all those counts, there is a severe legitimacy problem, but this is also a regime whose hardliners have never hesitated to gun down their own population. So who will win the political struggle, in my judgment, is an extraordinarily important question, but that exists a struggle, I think, is quite real. And on that, of course, I rely on commentators of Iran, mostly of Iranian origin, whose judgment and knowledge and also objectivity I personally trust.
So let's get to Trump. Apparently, Netanyahu is bringing the Abraham Accords back into focus with his return. Lots of talk about Trump's relationship with the Gulf. You noted Musk meeting with Iranian officials. There's a certain unpredictability about Trump, but he does have very good political instinct, especially when it comes to power and who holds it and who doesn't. What's the opportunity if Trump called you and said, Soli, how do I really win the Nobel Prize for peace? How do I bring peace to this region? What would you tell him?
Well, I mean, I go back to an earlier comment you made, when you said, well, okay, Hamas has taken a blow, Hezbollah has taken a blow, but can they not always come back? So the Palestinian issue still remains in place. That is Israel's impasse. Unless you basically kick out all the Palestinians who live in occupied territories and in Gaza, your problem, that is the question, the political question of what the Palestinians are going to do or what they're going to have, still remains in place. Is Trump interested in the creation of a Palestinian state? We haven't seen any indication of that, except for when he accepted when he decided that Jerusalem should be recognized as the capital of Israel. He did leave the door open for a two-state solution, however underplayed that dimension of that decision was. So I will see what he will do. And for him to do that, we'll have to count on the Saudis, who would probably have his ear. And if the Saudis remain true to their word, to MBS's, Mohammed bin Salman's word, that without a path that is recognizable and credible towards the creation of a Palestinian state, they will not normalize relations with Israel. If that is very important for Trump, then he will try to put Israelis. Although when you look at the people he sent to Israel as ambassadors, these guys are, to the right of Bibi Netanyahu. So, but then again, it's always the Nixon to China syndrome. Maybe the most hardline people are going to take the most difficult steps. But I really think Saudi Arabia will play a key role in there. And as for instance, a place like Lebanon, we now have another son-in-law, and this son-in-law happens to be Lebanese. Maybe he will have the other ear of Trump, and with his father in particular, who is also a special representative, they may actually educate him and maybe convince him to actually be more forward-looking and forthcoming.
You talk about a two-state solution. We've heard that again for a generation, more than a generation, 2 or 3 generations. But is that in 2025? Is that even conceivable? Is it possible, or is it an impossibility?
Impossible is nothing. That's what Adidas's slogan, or Nike's, I don't know.
Nike.
And Nike, right? It's very difficult. And of course, when we talk about the two-state solution today, it cannot be geographically well delineated to different political entities living side by side, but it will have to be probably a confederative arrangement. Now, I don't think the Israeli body politic, as it is currently constituted, with over 500,000 settlers who are actually vigilantes and bandits, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, With those guys, how can you really move forward is a big question. But the thing is, obviously, a one-state solution is not an option either, not today. And then the only thing that remains is either a continuation of the status quo. And as I said, if the Saudis do not want to accept that and they're not going to normalize relations with Israel, then that takes away from Trump or from any other American administration the possibility of basically leaving behind them a by and large stable Middle East where Israel has normal relations with all the relevant powers. And the fourth option would be to basically expel them, deportations. There are people in Israel who think that way, but there are also many other people in Israel who don't think that way. So we'll see what will happen and what kind of position the Trump administration is going to take about this particular issue.
That was an interesting headline in The Hill recently about the Kurds being America's allies. The US must defend them. Obviously, the Kurdish issue with the collapse of Syria has been inflamed again and impacts massively on Turkey. Erdogan is particularly, I don't know what the best word is, ideological when it comes to the Kurds. Can the Kurdish issue prove to be an opportunity again for Trump, for the peacemakers, for an attempt to transform a Mad Max future into a more civilized one?
I mean, first of all, the first thing we need to see is, will Trump accept the Pentagon's recommendation that they continue to stay in Syria? Remember, he wanted to out in 2019 and he was disobeyed. And in fact, the Pentagon said that they were raising the number of military advisors or personnel from 900 to 2,000 because of the circumstances. And the US has been very divided on the issue of whether they should trust the Turks to fight ISIS or they should continue to rely on Kurds. And there are lots of people like David Phillips, the article's author, who wants to favor the Kurds as opposed to Turkey. This will all depend on how the Turkish-American relations are going to evolve under Trump, and whether or not some formula could be found whereby at least the non-Syrian PYD fighters that may have come from different countries that are clearly affiliated with the PKK are actually made to leave. So, there are also different messages out of Turkey as well. We'll see what will happen.
What's Trump's relations with Erdogan?
Oh, he said that Erdogan is a strong man. He has done an unfriendly takeover of Syria. And that in a way, he says, okay, Turkey now owns the Syrian dossier, which is not necessarily a good thing because then you're responsible for everything that goes wrong as well. I think our government expects that, or the Turkish government expects that they will be able to reestablish the personal relations between the two presidents that existed between 2017 and 2021. Whether or not that will materialize also, in my judgment, is not yet certain.
Well, it's so much to think about. It's such a complicated jigsaw puzzle, Soli. It's so hard to predict. But let's end with one thing you'd really love to happen, something realistic, not a two-state solution, something concrete that is doable in the next 6 to 9 months in the Middle East broadly. And secondly, what you most fear. Let's end on that note. And I hope we'll talk during the year to see how your fears and hopes are being realized in the new year.
What I most fear is generalized chaos.
Mad Max.
It will be hell for the populations, and it will be pretty dangerous, I think, for the states in the region. What I would like to see is really an American approach, maybe prodded by the Saudis as well, to find ways of bringing calm and end the violence for the moment. And maybe bring in Iran to negotiations. Maybe the Europeans could be helpful in that. It is not inconceivable that the Trump administration, or some people in the Trump administration, with all the talk to the contrary, may wish to basically dissociate Iran from the so-called axis of resistance or rejection, that is Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Iran does have a political leadership, or it is partially a political leadership that is ready to do that. And that requires a lot of diplomatic investment, which maybe the United States should not shoulder on its own, but do try this with allies, whether they be in Europe or also in the region. That is not too likely, but it is not impossible either, because I really think that the region is sick and tired of wars.
Well, I think no one's going to argue on that front, Soli. It's been a momentous, tragic year, certainly in the Middle East, in Syria, in the occupied territories, in Gaza 2024. But we need our Soli Ozel in Istanbul and in Vienna to make sense of the region. Soli, a happy new year, a safe
Happy
new year
to you and your
and
viewers as well.
we will certainly talk in the next few months, because I don't think anyone will doubt the fact that stuff will happen, stuff that we don't expect, and stuff that will change the region. So thank you again, Soli Ozel.